Okay, we have some friends that may just be joining us live. So, welcome to you. My name is Daniela, and I'm here with Christopher. And we've created the Extraordinary Yoga Teacher Summit because we really believe that yoga teachers absolutely deserve support for your whole lives, not just your classes.
The heart of this gathering is the 30 teachers who are sharing their lived wisdom with you. These are not theoretical teachings, they're born from experience. Our intention is that you leave each session feeling more grounded, more confident, and more supported in your work and your purpose here on our earth. And it is with great joy and great respect that I welcome our next featured speaker. Satbir Singh Khalsa is a corresponding member of the Faculty of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Satbir Singh Khalsa is a corresponding member of the Faculty of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, retiring as Associate Professor of Medicine, and is also the Director of Research for the Kundalini Research Institute. He's conducted scientific research since 2001 on the efficacy of yoga for mental health. He chairs the Scientific Program Committee for the annual conference of the International Association of Yoga Therapists. He's editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, the medical editor of the Harvard Special Report Introduction to Yoga, and chief editor of the medical textbook, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. Welcome, Satbir.
Thank you, Christopher and Daniela, for this invitation to participate in this great event. It's really an honor. So what I'm going to share is going to be a little bit different than most of the other presenters are sharing. My presentation is entirely academic. And what I'm hoping to do is to share with you the science and research that's been undertaken with respect to research on yoga. And what we'll do is talk about the rationale for this, and also for sort of a review of the basic elements psychophysiologically about how yoga works with respect to the benefits on both physical and psychological functioning. And then maybe conclude with the sort of overall relevance of this to yoga practitioners, teachers, and to the public in general. So I want to, first of all, start with a definition that most researchers who are doing research on yoga use. Of course, a lot of yoga these days is basically focused on the postures and exercises, some of which you see illustrated here. And in fact, a good fraction of the practice in the West is nothing but postures. However, as you probably know, traditional yoga incorporates other very important components, including the breathing exercises, the pranayama practices, the deep relaxation, typically manifested as yoga nidra or shavasana, and then very importantly, the meditative component. And many scholars and academics can make a strong argument that actually meditation is the most important component of yoga, traditional yoga, and that the physical components are there really to support that meditative component. But I bring this forward just to note that most researchers are using yoga practices that incorporate all four of these components to some degree or other, depending upon the style of yoga. I want to start with talking about some of the evidence for the prevalence of yoga practice in modern society. And so this cartoon reads, in addition to 16 cup holders, it comes equipped with 4 dedicated yoga mat storage areas. And so this might suggest to you that yoga's become so popular that we're actually designing cars with yoga in mind. Well, I have not yet seen a car with a yoga mat storage area, but I suspect it's coming. In the meantime, you can get a yoga mat with a car on it. So for $75 on this website, you can have imprinted on your yoga mat car of your choice. And for illustration purposes, I chose this cool 1966 Lamborghini. Now, the prevalence of yoga has actually been measured most thoroughly by the United States government. And this has been in the National Health Interview Survey, which has been conducted every 5 years. And they've measured the prevalence of yoga practice as if an adult has practiced yoga within the past year. So what you can see is in 2002, that was 5% of US adults, and that has now more than tripled to almost 17% in 2022. And this percentage of 17% of the population involved in some kind of practice or behavior, from an epidemiological or sociological perspective, this is a major movement in the culture. So yoga really has become a part of Western and US society. And this kind of trend we see in many other countries as well. This trend is quite remarkable in and of itself. It's doubled every 10 years. And interestingly, it doesn't sort of show any signs of tapering off. So we'll see in the next survey in 2027 whether this holds true or not. So if we see this kind of statistic from the surveys, we would expect evidence in the culture. And of course, we do see this in the media. These are covers of very well-known paper magazines, Life magazine. This caption reads, "Dogs do it, kids do it, even desperate housewives do it. Why we've become a yoga nation." And this cover of Time magazine, "The Science of Yoga," with famous model Christy Turlington. And unfortunately, the media has portrayed this kind of image to be representative of yoga. And the problem with this is that most people in the general population consider that yoga is something that can only be practiced by thin, rich, elegant white females in leotards. And of course, this is a problem because we know that yoga can be practiced by anybody, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, creed, or physical limitations. So this is a problem for us in the yoga community to try and really make the point that yoga is for everyone. Another metric of how yoga has become popular is the appearance of yoga rooms in airports. We now have 5 airports and counting in the US which have yoga rooms. So during your connection between flights, you can go to these yoga rooms and practice yoga. And these are major airports: San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Miami. Another metric of the popularity of anything in a society is the toys that you see in that society. And so, of course, everybody's familiar with this doll Barbie, and there is now a made-to-move Barbie. And made-to-move Barbie is made to move so she can adopt all of these yoga asanas. There's also now a Breathe With Me Barbie that comes complete with 5 guided meditations. And for those that want to take the next step, there's Yoga Teacher Barbie. And Yoga Teacher Barbie comes complete with water bottle and yoga mat. And for those of a different persuasion, instead of toy soldiers bearing rifles and bazookas, there's Yoga Joes. And Yoga Joe figurines are practicing yoga asanas. One of the drives to the popularity internationally has been from Prime Minister Modi, who argued to the United Nations to adopt International Day of Yoga Practice celebration. And this is in 2015, the first celebration in New Delhi with Prime Minister Modi. And he brought a few friends to practice with him. That was 50,000 people. And the consulates around the world, the Indian consulates, really are actively involved in every country in promoting the celebration of the International Day of Yoga. Here in the US, we've actually had celebration on June 21st, even preceding that. This is the annual yoga practice on New York Times Square. These are remarkable photographs of people taking over Times Square to practice yoga. So again, another sign of its international reputation. And of course, anything that becomes popular also is, used by the media. So here they're selling a vodka bottle. This is a vodka bottle doing a headstand on a yoga mat. And here, this is an ad for an over-the-counter sleeping pill. This morning was brought to you by a good night's sleep. The idea being that if you take their sleeping pill, you'll get a good night's sleep and be more refreshed and able to do your yoga in the morning. And then we see it other places. This is major corporations like McDonald's. This was on my fruit and yogurt cup, very clear image of somebody practicing yoga, complete with Gyan Mudra. And then, of course, this is independent of location within the country, even in the deep south. So this is downtown Birmingham, Alabama. Free yoga. Bend over and pick up your pet waste. Call it downward dog. So really, yoga really has been deeply embedded into the culture. So having said that, the question is, why do we want to do research on yoga? It looks like people are practicing. Well, I think we see this popularity in the general population, yoga centers, fitness centers, spas, and ashrams, and so on. But we are starting to see a trickle into mainstream society, into mainstream society's institutions, the public schools, the workplaces, and the healthcare system. And that is a nice transformation because once we get it into these societal venues, then everyone will get yoga. And I say that because right now the demographics of yoga practice in the US are very much skewed towards women, towards people of higher education, towards people of higher wealth, and towards whites. And so that disparity really can be addressed by bringing yoga into mainstream institutions. But the challenge to that implementation requires research. Um, School district supervisors need research to justify the implementation of yoga in schools. Workplaces want to see the cost benefit of bringing yoga to their workers. And the healthcare system will want to know safety and efficacy of any kind of yoga practice that they give to their patients. So research is really critical for this implementation to be more deeply implemented across society. This cartoon reads, how is it we're the most successful species on the planet, yet we need to pay people to remind us to breathe and drink water? And one of the things about yoga is it's a behavioral practice. You don't pop out of the womb onto a yoga mat. You have to be taught these practices and learn them. So now I want to turn our attention to the psychophysiology of yoga. How does yoga work on the mind and on the body? And this is an active and growing area of research, and we're starting to see this manifest in different places. I was actually invited by Harvard Medical School Health Publishing to be a medical editor of a book called An Introduction to Yoga. And in this book, we include a lot of the research that's been done on yoga for a variety of different conditions and health and wellness in general. And if you go onto the Harvard Health Publishing website, you'll actually see articles on some of this research, this one being on yoga for anxiety and depression. A strong metric of how any field of research, clinical research, or psychophysiology research is growing is the appearance of what we call review papers or meta-analyses. And so this slide shows a number of meta-analyses and reviews that have been published just within the past 5 years. And you can see some of the titles here, effects of yoga on gene expression, this one here on changes in body awareness, this one on neurocognitive, psychological, and physiological outcomes, this one on stress, this one on aging physiology, up at the top here, stress again, clinical benefits on epigenetics and gene expression, psychological benefits in inflammation, and mental health benefits at the bottom. And all of this research is giving us a lot of information about how yoga is working on the mind and on the body. And we've also included a review of this in our medical textbook, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. In our chapter 4, The Psychophysiology of Yoga, we review this literature and derive a model that I'm going to share with you today. But I want to go back historically to some of the early research, which of course began in India. One of the studies that was being done was to study advanced practitioners, yoga masters, took them up and see what was going on when they were doing their practices. This is probably the largest study of that kind. It was in the 1950s. This team of researchers traveled all over India for a year, finding these masters and then hooking them up to the equipment you see here. And their conclusion from this study was that physiologically, yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system. There's two important, very key points that underlie the basis of not only yoga research, but all of mind-body medicine. And the first one of these is the idea of self-regulation of internal state. The autonomic nervous system was called autonomic because it was believed to be automatic. This is the fight or flight response, the stress response. And here are these yogis who can control the stress response, which was believed in modern medicine not to be under control. So this whole idea of self-regulation of internal state is important because in modern medicine, this construct is pretty much absent. And in modern medicine, the practitioner does something to you, for you, gives you a pill, a surgery. And here is the idea that through these training practices, you can make changes inside your own internal functioning, both physical and psychological. The other important point here is that the autonomic nervous system is one of the two systems that comprises the stress response system, the other being the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, whose output is the stress hormone cortisol. And so we now know through a lot of research that's supported that yoga is very good at managing stress and the stress response. Again, something which modern medicine is not very good at. There is no pill, there is no strategy within modern medical technology to address the stress response and chronic stress. Now, turning to these individual components of yoga, of course, these postures and exercises are very different than Western aerobic exercises. They're focused more on flexibility, isometric exercises. And it's no surprise that if you take naive individuals, give them 8 weeks of asana practice, you'll see improvements in flexibility, muscular endurance, and muscle strength, as you see published in this trial here. And this is no surprise. When you do flexing exercises, you'll become more flexible. And so this is very strong objective evidence, and a lot of studies have really supported this benefit. One of the interesting things here is the mind-body connection. As you relax the body, you have an effect psychologically. So this is not just physical changes. These physical changes are having an effect on psychological functioning to some degree as well. And turning our attention to the relaxation practices, we know that Shavasana generates this sense of relaxation. And this has been practiced actually in the West by psychologists, and it's been called progressive relaxation. This is one trial that showed that progressive relaxation makes psychological changes as well. In this study, you can see those practicing the progressive relaxation in this study had a reduction in perceived stress compared to the controls. They had a reduction in anxiety, increase in the sense of relaxation, and actually changes in physiological measures, including a reduction in heart rate and a reduction in the stress hormone cortisol. So in addition to relaxing the physical body, again, you're having impact on psychological functioning just through the relaxation effects. Turning our attention to pranayama, the most central practice within pranayama is the slow, deep diaphragmatic breathing or the belly breathing. Again, this has also been used in Western psychology for decades, and the research here is really phenomenal. We are starting to see enormous impacts of slow breathing on both the central and the autonomic nervous system, and these changes really can be long-term changes that take place. One of the things that's affected is the stress response. This trial showed that in response to a stressor, those individuals that were practicing the slow breathing had a reduced stress response. We can also see that slow breathing immediately has impact on the autonomic nervous system by reducing blood pressure, reducing heart rate. So we know it has an immediate effect on the stress response as well as mood states such as anxiety. And finally, turning our attention to the fourth component, which is the meditative component. One of the modern technologies that's made us really advance this field substantially is the use of brain imaging techniques. What's shown here is the fMRI, and this is really yielding phenomenal results in terms of our understanding how meditative practices work on the central nervous system. One of the questions that's been asked is, does brain function change with meditation? And the answer to that seems to be yes. Studies have compared meditators with non-meditators. This particular study showed that changes appear in structures that underlie the attention network and those that relate to emotion and autonomic function. So the emotion and autonomic function match with what we see behaviorally, and the attention networks are changing because at its core, meditation engages the attention networks in the focus of attention. The other thing we can see is not only changes in brain activity, but changes in brain structure. This is known as neuroplasticity. In this study done at our National Institutes of Health, they looked at long-term practitioners and showed that in general, their tolerance to cold pain was greater than the general population that was not practicing. Furthermore, when they looked at the volume of the region of the brain involved in pain regulation, it was actually larger in volume compared to the non-practitioners. And that volume increase was related to how long the practitioners had been practicing yoga. So not only can we change brain activity with meditative practices, we can actually change brain structure as well. Now, of course, meditation is the focus of attention and involves our regulation of thought processes. This cartoon reads, "Meditation isn't what you think." And of course, when we meditate, we all experience intrusions of mind wandering. This is normal for anyone that practice meditation, regardless of their degree of practice or their history of practice. So really, meditation in the real world is this cycle of holding your meditative focus, whether that's on a mantra, on a candle, on a word or a phrase. And that intrusion of mind wandering, we then notice that, and then we bring ourselves back to the task by focusing our attention again. So really, meditation in the real world is a cycle of focus, mind wandering, focus, mind wandering. And mind wandering is interesting because it is something that is involved in our thought process. It's a key aspect of our thought processes, and it's now being studied. This was a study by a Harvard research team studying mind wandering in the general populations. They found, unsurprisingly, people's minds wandered frequently, regardless of what they were doing. However, people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not, suggesting there's an emotional cost to excessive mind wandering. And the reason for this is in the content. Mind wandering is a survival advantage. We're mostly focusing on mind wandering on survival issues. And survival issues are stressful because we don't know the outcome. We don't know if we'll survive. Now, these can be trivial. They can be, how am I going to deal with my bank overdraft? Will I have enough funds to send my child to college, etc.? But every time you have one of these survival thoughts, you're generating a stress response, a mini stress response. So if you're constantly thinking this way, 24/7, 365 days of the year, you're going to develop chronic stress. So how does meditation fit into this? Well, you focus your attention, and the attention networks can only do one thing at a time. So as you're focusing attention, mind wandering stops. So at least for the amount of time you're holding attention, you are free from that negative content. What is more important is you are learning the skill of controlling your attention, noticing that you are mind wandering, and being aware of that mind wandering and the content of that mind wandering. And you become to the realization that you are not your thoughts. And this realization is called basically metacognition, the idea that you have the ability as a human to self-regulate your own thought processes. And this is a really key finding within the neuroscience of meditation. We can actually see this happening in the brain scanner. This was a study done on meditators in the scanner. And during the focus phase, when they're successfully holding their attention, what's being activated is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is in the attention networks, in the frontal lobes, in the executive regions of the brain. However, when the mind was wandering, it's an entirely different set of regions of the brain called the default mode network. And we're now understanding the relationship between these two different networks, and we're understanding how this focus phase has its positive benefits. We know, for example, that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has quieting, inhibiting effects on the limbic system, the region of the brain where emotions and stress are expressed. So this is really fundamentally informing us about how meditation is working in the brain. Thanks to yoga, I now gently stretch to conclusions instead of jumping to them. And this cartoon really reflects this whole idea of metacognition, of self-regulation of thought processes. Now, I've talked a lot about stress. And stress is one of the things that really has come up. This is a review of studies that have included measurements of stress with yoga. This review revealed that most types of yoga have positive effects on stress reduction in healthy populations. This was published 5 years ago. This is a 2025 publication, which found a statistically significant moderate effect of yoga on reducing perceived stress. And it's not just on questionnaire measures of stress. It's also measuring objective measures such as the stress hormone cortisol, systolic blood pressure, heart rate variability, blood glucose, and even blood lipids, showing improved regulation of the two stress response systems in the body. And just to show you some evidence from our research, this was a study we did at the Kripalu Yoga Center in a week-long retreat. And what we found was perceived stress was reduced at the end of the week-long retreat and maintained a lot of the benefits 2 months after. And we've also seen this in education professionals. After a 6-week intervention, the yoga group showed a reduction in perceived stress compared to the controls and a trend for increasing resilience to stress by the 2-month follow-up. We've even gone to Harvard physicians at Brigham and Women's Hospital and delivered this in the hospital to these physicians and showed after 6 weeks a reduction in perceived stress that was maintained and an increase in resilience to stress that was maintained. And this cartoon reads, frankly, counselor, I don't care how stressful this is for your client. Tell him to get out of that damn yoga position. Another important finding within yoga that comes with practice is an increase in mind-body awareness. This is also now known popularly as mindfulness. And we know that yoga increases mindfulness. In this review of changes in body awareness of the 21 studies that examined differences in body awareness between a yoga group and a control group, reported significant differences in favor of yoga. This was a study done in Germany on long-term yoga practitioners, which found that those that were practicing yoga at a higher intensity more regularly had higher scores of mindfulness than those that were practicing moderately or marginally. We've also seen this over the short term. These frontline professionals in the week-long retreat showed increases in mindfulness that were maintained at the 2-month follow-up. We also saw this in the education professionals, increasing at the end of the 6 weeks, maintained at 2 months, and then also in the Harvard physicians, increasing their scores of mindfulness, which were also maintained at 2 months. Another component of yoga, which historically is one of the goals of yoga practice, is this elevation of this state of consciousness, so-called samadhi state. And we can see changes in yoga on a temporal time frame. Over the short term, within minutes, so a yoga class, we see this arousal reduction, physical and mental well-being. This has been called the relaxation response. With regular practice over time, we see increases in mind-body awareness, mindfulness, resilience, and self-regulation. So these are skill sets that begin to develop. And many people who've practiced yoga over the much longer term talk about psychological and philosophical transformations. They say things like, yoga changed my life. So this touches on spirituality, this change in perception. And this is that same study in Germany showing that spiritual well-being was highest in individuals practicing more intensively and less in those practicing less intensively. And these spiritual changes are associated with positive psychological states such as cope, connectedness, and experiences of sense and meaning. And we've seen this even in young adult musicians in the flow questionnaire, which measures a flow state, this sense of this unitive state during an activity, in this case, music performance. In our study, we showed increases in dispositional flow compared to those that were not practicing yoga. So this brings us, with all of this information, to be able to construct a model. Yoga, as we've said, is these 4 different components. And we know that each one of these components by itself or together in yoga makes changes on the physical level. In a box I'm calling fitness, improving things like flexibility, strength, coordination, balance, respiratory function, and self-efficacy. And of course, through the mind-body connection, has an impact psychologically. Each one of these practices by itself or together in yoga in some combination improves self-regulation of internal state. Most notably stress and emotion regulation, which leads to the skill of resilience and tolerance to stress, emotional equanimity, and overall mental health self-efficacy. It's mostly through the meditative component of yoga, engaging the attention networks, we increase mind-body awareness or mindfulness, which improves our cognitive ability, our concentration, and ultimately over time leads to these metacognitive state, this realization of our ability to self-regulate our thought processes. And then finally, it's primarily through the meditative component that we see the induction of these tranquil states, which lead to these deep unitive states, these experiences of transcendence, flow, leading to this sort of deeper transformation in life, meaning, and purpose in a box I'm calling spirituality. So one thing you can see from this model is we're making changes across a broad spectrum of human functioning, from the gross level of muscle and connective tissue to the deepest experiences that humans can have. And then in terms of the research, it's very, very strong here. These are very objective measures. It's been done for decades. The past 2 to 3 decades has seen enormous advances in these 2 boxes of self-regulation and mind-body awareness due to strategies like measures of EEG, measures of neuroimaging, measures of biochemistry, measures of heart rate variability, and a number of other different very important measures, including things like molecular biological techniques. And then finally, the weak sister in terms of research is spirituality, although research is starting here and is becoming recognized as something that is important to modern medicine. So in summary, we're making changes in global human functionality, improving in physical and mental health and performance, stress and emotion regulation, awareness, mindfulness, and metacognition to the deepest experiences, including spirituality. And we can even see this in people's experiences. So these are quotes from people who have been involved in our studies with yoga in the Kripalu interventions. This week was at Kripalu was amazing and made me feel how good I can feel and so quickly. I felt better in my body, stronger and straighter, clear-headed and more balanced. Another said, I feel the most physically and mentally healthy I've ever felt in my adult life. Another said, a week in which I felt more relaxed than I can even remember. In terms of self-regulation of internal state, one said, I'm better able to handle my emotions. I can stay calm and centered in trying times. A huge shift in how I process stress, both professional and personal, lifted me out of burnout. In terms of mind-body awareness, the Kripalu experience helped me become aware of just how unaware I was of myself and my body. Another said, I'm more mindful of how food, breathing, and mindfulness can affect my performance and state of mind. And another said, it's given me skills necessary to notice my emotions before acting on them. And then finally, in the topic of spirituality, we don't see much in 2 months, but these are suggestive quotes. This has been a life-changing grounding experience. I've noticed a positive shift in my entire life, a renewed sense of purpose, increased appreciation for life, stillness, mindfulness, and nature, life-changing. So really, this model allows us to talk about yoga in a different way. It allows us to use scientific language to talk about the different aspects of yoga, which happens to be the language of modern society. And if we want to get yoga into society's institutions, we need to be talking the scientific language of yoga. And this is what will allow us to penetrate these societal institutions and get yoga distributed to the entire population. So I want to bring your attention to the principles and practice of yoga and healthcare. This is a medical textbook. 100 international yoga researchers contributed to this medical textbook, summarizing in a very scientific and clinical way the research that's been done on yoga for a variety of different mental and physical conditions. We've also just recently published the principles and practice of yoga from children and adolescents, talking about the value of that by researchers who have conducted research in that field. I also serve as the director of research for the Kundalini Research Institute, which represents the style of yoga I practice. And I also serve with the International Association of Yoga Therapists. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy and coordinate the scientific component of our annual meeting, the Symposium on Yoga Therapy and Research. This organization, I believe, is the leading yoga organization in the West. It accredits yoga therapy schools and certifies yoga therapists. And everyone who has an interest in the science and research and clinical application of yoga should consider the annual Symposium on Yoga Therapy and Research, which this year will be in Costa Mesa, California on June 11th to 13th. And I close with this cartoon. One of the things that's really important about yoga is its ability to address a major challenge in modern society, which is an epidemic of non-communicable diseases. These include all the major diseases that are killing people, 90% of all deaths. This includes chronic diseases like diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and then psychological conditions like depression and anxiety. And unfortunately, our society does not have the skills in its schools, in the therapy, to address this by providing skills that can reduce stress and improve mind-body awareness. And I'm hoping that with the research growing in this area, ultimately we will have more and more yoga research embedded deeply into our societal institutions, especially our public schools, so that hopefully in the future we can change this cartoon to a nicer version. So thanks very much for your attention, and I am happy to take any questions if there's time.
Sapir, thank you so much. That was incredibly, my mind is blown. I had no idea that there was so much research that really justifies what we all know and believe to be true. Does anyone have any specific questions? We have a few minutes here. Go ahead and leave in the chat anything that you would love to know. Daniela, did you have any questions or follow-up?
I can always come up with questions, and I want to make sure that our friends that are here have an opportunity to ask their questions. I'm paying attention in the chat.
Okay.
Oh, let's see. Can we unmute Dipti?
Sure.
Go ahead.
ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ
That's the call.
I would like to know what changes happen in the body as Kundalini energy rises through the Agna.
So now we're talking yoga language. And of course, in yoga, as most of you have learned who practiced yoga, there is a whole body of knowledge that really talks about what in integrative medicine is called energy medicine. The whole idea of subtle energies within the body and how yoga has an impact on these subtle energies. So we have constructs such as Kundalini, which rises up the spine. We have this construct of the chakras, which is these energy centers throughout the body, and many other different elements. We have the koshas, we have the nadis, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, at this point in time, I'm not convinced that we have the technology to measure these energetic constructs. And that is a problem, because unless we can measure them, we can't really see what's happening with them as they change. So most of the research is really focused on medical technology in which we can measure things that we can measure, things like heart rate variability, the function of the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system, our hormone levels, etc. So until we have those kinds of devices that reliably can give us that information, unfortunately, we can't say much about that from a scientific perspective.
Yes.
Furthermore,
Mhm.
my opinion has always been that we should still really focus on the physical and psychological changes, because that is the greatest need right now. The need we have right now is to stem this epidemic of chronic disease, of lifestyle disease, which is gripping the entire planet, and for which modern medicine has entirely failed to address. Because modern medicine is not focused on prevention, and it's not focused on changes in behavior. It's not good at changing behavior. And that's what's necessary in an epidemic of lifestyle disease. So the more we can focus on how yoga can impact chronic disease through changes in mindfulness, through changes in stress reduction, that to me is the need of the hour, if you will. And that is where our energy should be going. And although I'm as interested in the whole idea of Kundalini yoga and chakras and maybe research that would identify those, I think it's more important for us as researchers to be really focusing on what society really needs the most, and which will provide the greatest benefit to humanity if we can get yoga embedded into our schools and into our healthcare system.
By default, if we go to Hatha Yoga also asanas work on the energy system only.
I think everything works on
Yeah.
the chakras and on Kundalini. I mean, even if you're jogging and meditating while you're jogging, I'm sure that there are changes. I mean, I don't think Tai Chi. I mean, does Tai Chi raise Kundalini? I mean, I don't think Kundalini and chakras are of the domain and province of yoga alone. I think this is a mind-body phenomenon if we can measure it someday, and I don't think it's unique to any particular type of practice. So whether you're practicing mindfulness meditation alone, or concentrative meditation alone, or just breathing alone, I think you're having an effect on these subtle energies as well as psychophysiological changes.
Mhm. Thank you.
Sadhbir, David in the chat asks, can you speak to mantra and chanting?
I can definitely speak to that. It's definitely a form of meditation. So from that perspective, yes, you are doing a form of meditation. Furthermore, if you're doing it out loud as opposed to silent mantra repetition, you are then slowing the breath as well. So if you're doing chanting out loud like kirtan, you are slowing the breath and you are meditating, which are two of the core practices of those four elements of yoga. And certainly from that perspective, yes, I believe that that's very beneficial. And there are some studies that have shown that mantra meditation and mantra chanting do have positive effects on psychophysiology. What we don't know yet is the idea that specific mantras may have specific benefits. So, for example, in yoga, the term Om, the practice of chanting Om, is viewed as something very sacred. And there's a belief that there's something special to practicing Om practice. I have not seen a definitive study that's properly controlled that will really allow us to make that conclusion yet. So that remains to be determined. I mean, you have to compare Om chanting with some other kind of chanting, which is a neutral chanting, some kind of nonsense mantra, for example. But the problem there is that if you do the study in India, everybody knows about Om. So you have a huge expectation effect, which is going to affect your research. So it's a very difficult question to answer, this particular question about the specificity of certain mantras. That doesn't mean I'm suggesting we shouldn't practice mantras. Uh, we don't want to restrict our practice to only things that have been researched. We take things on faith. A lot of us practice yoga on faith because we've experienced the benefits. So I'm not suggesting we don't practice, but I'm just saying from a scientific perspective, it's very difficult to do that kind of research.
Thank you. And before we conclude this session and prepare for the next one at 12:30, could you please tell us a little bit about the wonderful gift that you have for our participants that are here today? Christopher has shared a link in the chat, and this will come out to you in email as well, friends. It is a chapter on meditation. So tell us a little bit about what we get to look forward to, and thank you for your generosity.
Yeah, well, this chapter will sort of talk about these basic principles that we've talked about in the logic model, really talking about, the whole idea of how it works, what the focus is, what you're doing when you meditate, the whole idea of the attention networks and the changes that take place as a consequence of being able to focus attention, and how this is a really fundamental practice. And it is so actually fundamentally simple, and yet, it still needs to be taught. We still need to understand this. Many people have come to this naturally and realize that they might be doing meditative practices without really knowing that they're doing so-called meditative practices. And the same is true for some religious practices, in which there's a focus of attention. That's true mostly in Oriental practices, in which a mantra is actually used and the instruction is actually to focus attention. In fact, the first ever definition of meditation occurred in the Upanishads, and it was done as an analogy, the idea of you as a charioteer driving horses. And that is your mind controlling your thoughts, your wandering mind, which are the horses. If you control those horses, control the thoughts, focus your attention, you get to go somewhere useful. Otherwise, if you just let the horses go anywhere, you end up anywhere. So there's a benefit to focusing attention through that analogy. So that is really the core of what meditation is. It's that focus of relaxed, non-analytical focus of attention.
Thank you. And there are two questions that I want to ask really quickly. Becca asked, what's the best way to stay in touch with you or to follow you or to learn more with you? Where would you like people to go?
Well, I think if you go on to PubMed, that is the best way to really be in touch with the entire field of yoga research. And if you type in the word yoga and type in the word review, you will come up with all the papers that have been published that reviews a study on yoga, especially if you specify within the PubMed search that you're looking for yoga in the title and the word review in the title. And then you scan through those, and a lot of those abstracts or citations will be freely accessible. And this will allow you to read that review paper and get an understanding of how much we've learned about yoga, either for a certain kind of function, such as memory or brain longevity, or in terms of yoga as a treatment for a specific condition. And usually the introduction is very, very readable and gives you a sense of where we are in the field. So I think that is probably the best way to stay in touch with this research. And PubMed is a free access website run by the US government. So it's there. And as researchers, we use this every day, multiple times every day.
And our last question, Anna, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions here and in the chat, so please accept our apologies. Karen has asked, in your presentation, you mentioned several times intensification of practice. What is meant by that phrase in the research?
So in a study that was done in Germany, they sort of broke it down into how much people were practicing. And this, I don't remember specifics in the paper, but the way to measure this is the number of hours of practice per day, the number of days per week, the number of weeks per month, how many years they've been practicing. So you can quantify how much someone has practiced. And because yoga is a behavioral practice, the more you do it, the more you engage these underlying psychophysiological changes, and the more benefit you have. So intensity basically just means how often and how long do you practice. And the more you do that and the longer you do that, the more you have impact on your psychophysiological functioning, both in terms of activity as well as brain structure and body structure.
Thank you kindly. Thank you, Satbir. So wonderful to have you here. What a gift.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.